not only did we fail to spread human rights everywhere, we're on the verge of losing them in our own country because our own fellow citizens are throwing liberalism overboard. And so what were our mistakes that led us to not understand that this could happen to begin with? And then what were the mistakes that led all of our fellow citizens to end up voting for a charlatan not once, but twice?
You can go country by country, you see a rise of authoritarian regimes. It feels to me like since World War II, there's a framework that we're working under, and it seems like that framework is now changing. Did we have an understanding of human rights that has now changed? Was it all a fantasy? Was there some reality to it? What's going on in this moment right now?
Well, it's clear that there's some kind of authoritarian backlash against the wave of democracy. I wouldn't associate it with the end of World War II because there you're just getting Western Europe and Japan. Whereas since the 1970s, which is really only the first time that there are big movements talking about human rights and politicians, there has been an advance of electoral democracy around the world. Now, I would say that things are shifting not because we're reverting to despotism straight out, which is the normal form of human government, but rather a kind of conservative form of democracy or an illiberal form of democracy that doesn't honor human rights or not in the same way, but also doesn't get rid of at least many of the trappings of liberal democracy. So you look at Viktor Orban's Hungary or likely Donald Trump's America in his second presidency. And I would say these are going to be distinguished by, claims to be conforming with the Constitution and with at least some human rights. I mean, the first term, Donald Trump had Mike Pompeo, his Secretary of State, set up a commission on inalienable rights, which claimed to embrace human rights from a conservative perspective. So I would say there's a shift, but it's not a shift backwards to the period before human rights. It's to a new conservative era.
Different countries have different feelings. You talked about Viktor Orban. Do we have a common framework, or are there many different kinds of frameworks around the world of our understanding of human rights?
Well, a little of both. I mean, if I said, is there a common framework in Christianity, there are probably some basics that everyone agrees about, like Jesus lived and he was the first coming of the Messiah, and then there's a second coming in the offing or whatever. And similarly, there's a list of human rights in the Universal Declaration from 1948 that no one repudiates. And in fact, Americans, for most of the time since the 70s, when they purported to care about human rights, ignored half the list, the so-called economic and social rights. And Pompeo was actually the first to change that and said, no, the whole list we care about. And even those states like China that say, well, we do a lot of economic development because that you have to even have civil liberties, they don't purport to reject the basic list. On the other hand, every right requires interpretation, like every right in the U.S. Constitution. And we all allegedly agree about those, but then the Supreme Court changes what they mean every year. So I would say it's a little of both. And that's just true with everything. I mean, there's one Bible, but then there are 1,000 readings of it. And there's one, James Joyce's Ulysses, and there are 18,000 books about how you understand it. So what's new?
That one's pretty complicated to get an understanding of in particular.
I think that's true. I mean, what's distinctive about human rights is, and that most people don't understand, is that almost no human rights are absolute. There's you can't torture, although even there, you can engage in, let's call it brutality short of torture or cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, which is also prohibited. And then there's always going to be, even with an absolute right like that, an exercise in line drawing, what counts, what doesn't, waterboarding, yes, no. But then every other right, free speech, etc., well, they're not absolute. And then somebody has to decide what is the content of the right And there's just going to be a huge amount of disagreement, and different panels of judges will say different things and so forth.
Can I ask a question about this trend towards a more conservative interpretation of human rights? What does that even mean? Is it just open to the person in charge with power to interpret that? Like, where are we headed with that kind of concept? Scary to me.
You know, the funny thing is, in the 1940s, which Jesse referenced, because of this mythology that was created really in the 1990s about when human rights became popular, most people who were like left or progressive weren't that into human rights. They were into socialism. Like in this country, they were not socialist outright, but they were heirs of Franklin Roosevelt and had just fought a big battle, if you like, against libertarians who said human rights means you can't tax us or, you know, have a regulatory state. And so in the 40s, like many of the people who stand up for human rights are conservative. And when you look not so much in this country, but in Western Europe, where most of the governments are what we call Christian democratic, they're the ones who are into human rights. And they say, well, we're Christians who believe in human dignity. And what that means is, you know, morality and family, community. Remember, there's no abortion rights in the Universal Declaration. The death penalty is definitely not off the table. Back then, no one thinks it is. And no one thinks of human rights in that era in the way they will just a few decades later when socialism dies. And let's say liberals and progressives co-opt human rights as like their language successfully. And that's when you get the founding of Human Rights Watch. And it's promoting like what let's say liberal elites like you and me value. And conservatives are outraged, you know, and they say, well, wait a second, our human rights just got hijacked. And now people are promoting feminism and, you know, gay rights, and those aren't in the Universal Declaration, maybe feminism a little bit. And so, you know, the rise of conservative populist human rights is kind of like saying we want our marbles back, and that we're not against human rights the way that like Adolf Hitler had been, or Francisco Franco, or, you know, someone like that. We're for them, but just in a conservative reading, which makes them compatible with community and morality. And so I'm not saying these are people on whose side I sit, but they have a claim to them in the same way that like there have been readings of James Joyce's Ulysses I disagree with, but they're offered from the perspective of their readers. So unless you just say conservatism can't be reconciled with human rights, then I think we have to like struggle on the terrain of human rights for our preferred understandings of them, rather than saying this is just a lie.
One of the things in human rights, we can all believe in human rights, but, you know, we have to believe in an open society, that there's a square and that we're all members of the square and we're having a conversation with one another. But then a group comes in and decides that maybe they don't believe in that. You know, we see immigration going on in Western Europe, and societies are really struggling with this influx of immigrants. And in Paris, you see, we almost went completely to the right in terms of the government. And I think we maybe pulled back from the abyss a bit. But how do we wrestle with groups that don't believe in an open society when we're all living in an open society? You know, that was always a kind of abstraction, but now it's very much seems like it's being torn, you know, or attempted to be torn apart. What's your reflections on that?
I wonder how open were our societies to begin with, because if you look at that old Universal Declaration, there's a right to leave your country, there's a right to return to it, there's a right to move within it, but there's no right to enter any other country. A little bit after, there's a refugee convention, and it says you have an asylum right if you can reach the port or border of another state, and you can say that you have a well-founded fear of persecution in where you came from. And then on one of 5 grounds, like it has to be because your government is targeting you for racial reasons or religious reasons or whatever. Economic need doesn't count as the ground of an asylum right. So never did human rights, on paper at least, mean there was an open society in the sense to which you referred. there was more generosity in Europe, largely because Europe needed migrant workers, and it brought them from its former empire or kind of imperial spaces like Turkey in the case of Germany. And then really like the Iraq war and its aftermath, the Syrian crisis caused this huge influx of refugees that ended up, as you say, inciting a huge right-wing backlash, or at least being a pretext for it, because Hungary, which we've already mentioned, accepted a grand total of 0 Syrian refugees. Other countries like Germany accepted some, or, we could debate whether
Sure.
it's, a lot or a little.
Germany probably needed them, because they need people to do those jobs. Ultimately, is it a question of national identity versus just allowing people to migrate?
I guess I was just making the basic point that it seems like this is not about human rights, because human rights never gave migrants much and in a sense didn't interfere with whatever policy a nation set up, welcoming or not. But I agree with you that this reminds us that even West European countries, which we talked about in the 90s and after as having learned from the Holocaust and having set up a kind of moral utopia almost, they were defined by xenophobia and whiteness, and so is the United States. And then you get these politicians who bring out that latent identity and can successfully parlay it when there are these new migratory pressures, or too many you don't want, or just economic crisis generally, which leads citizens to scapegoat others as if they're threatening. So I guess I'm wondering, maybe we never progressed enough towards an open society, and so it was easy for charlatans to close it.
Boy, that's a tough, it's a tough reality.
Bleak.
Yeah. But how do we wrestle with cultural identities being lost?
I mean, that's a real issue in a sense that presumably we all think that our culture may be worth perpetuating. Like, I care about the Jewish holidays and the Jewish dishes I learned how to make and I want my children to make. And, maybe you say even at the level of nations that there are cultural practices that they have, if not an obligation, then a right to want to preserve. And then we're in a debate about, like, if there are newcomers, are they required to be inducted in those? How are those traditions perpetuated? But you alluded to this very stark demographic reality, which, America is a little behind Europe, which is that the old immigrants, because in the end, everyone, even in Europe, is an immigrant. No one, like very few people are descendants of the Franks or like whatever the German tribes were. They are aging and they're not very numerous, and they need care because they're old and they have not adequately reproduced. All of these societies are below replacement rate. You have to have an average of 2.2 children per woman to have a stable population. And this group of people, the inheritors of Europe or the United States, aren't doing that. I think in America, it's 1.6, lower in Western Europe. So then you import people who you don't acculturate, and they have their traditions, just like we have ours, that they want to perpetuate and honor. Maybe they can combine them with the ones of the place they come for economic or other reasons. So it's a huge quandary. I don't have a solution, but I guess my take is, like, as a cosmopolitan, we live in this incredible era when I can go to restaurants like of every cuisine in the world within a 15-minute drive and go to cultural festivals. So I think it's really when economic, if not hardship, then stagnation hits people that they begin to resist the kind of cultural change that is inevitable across human history and is a good thing. So I would work on that, because that's the kind of ultimate driver. Like, people scapegoat others and fear cultural difference, not because they're fearful, but because they have other things they fear.
In Japan, you see that birth rate falling. World Health Organization seems to keep readjusting these numbers. I remember a few years ago, it was 6 or 7 billion, and now they keep adjusting the number upwards, and population seems to keep going up. But if it falls back, will that take pressure away from these extremes that we're feeling now, ultimately?
I think the story of world population is that it's still growing, but there's an end in sight unless other things change. But it's really in crisis in East Asia. I think Korea is South Korea got the worst statistic, even worse than China and Japan. But then there are places like Africa where the population is still growing and above replacement rate. So, if your question is what will happen if and when that stops too, well, I don't think anything bad. There's no correct population of the earth. What I see as fundamental is that there's a disparity in how rich people are in different places in the world, and therefore life outcomes. And people with worse ones want to get to places where there are better ones, and those are the places that are having these demographic compressions. And so then, to a degree, all of those places will want migrants as they age to take care of them, since they don't have their own children to do so. But at the same time, there may be others who aren't as old who fear those immigrants. And so that could be a big explanation for why you're seeing this populist wave across the planet, because you've also got tons of African migrants into China, just as an example. Like in certain cities, you have, hundreds of thousands of Nigerian immigrants, and we don't connect that always with the West European or American stories. But I don't think there's any right answer to how many people there should be on the planet. I don't see why there would be.
I don't know much about that. Nigerian immigrants to China, and it's easy for them to get in, or are they given permission to come in, or they?
Yeah, it's like the Western European system. There's like a guest worker system, and remember, China is deeply involved in African affairs, buying up lots of arable land because they have foreseen a kind of resource crises of the future with global warming. They want to get control of arable land to feed their own population. But they're famously having had to control their birth rate under Mao. And after, they're now suffering the kind of replacement rate crises themselves in mainland China. And so they have an increasing need as a graying population for younger people to come from somewhere to take care of them. And this is mainly in cities for rich Chinese, but yeah, Africans are doing some of that work, or it just involved in trade relationships with Africa that crop up when a big country, goes abroad and buys a lot of land and has economic relations.
What is that dynamic like? And is there an embracing of some of the cultural things that are being brought into? How is that being reconciled?
I'm not a huge expert, but beyond what I've said, it's a great question. I mean, my understanding is that there is sort of in the position where America was in the late 19th and especially early 20th centuries, where there were big immigrant populations in urban settings, first in the northeast of the United States. And those people often spoke different languages than English, certainly as a mother tongue, but also could live their whole lives in relatively close proximity to other Italians or Jews or whatever. And they may have had a big economic relationship with their new country, but they were not in the early days really engaged in tons of interaction with like the old stock Protestants and vice versa. And then things change and there's like pizza goes national and all, like that hasn't happened to the best of my understanding in China. In part because it's just a much smaller scale phenomenon by the numbers so far. I mean, China is immense, and we're talking about like an African migration that's pretty localized in a few cities in one region. But it's early days, and a lot could change.
Have you been surprised by the effect of the Palestinian cause in America and sort of the disconnect? At least I feel the disconnect between what Hamas is and what people are chanting for on campuses. There's almost it's not connected to a reality, in a sense.
Yeah, I would say I was surprised by how big a dent on the national conversation young people who were pushing like in new directions have had. But then I thought maybe I shouldn't be surprised, because I think there's a long brewing, in a sense, crisis in the relationship between American liberals of all sorts, old, young, Jewish, non-Jewish on the one hand, and the state of Israel on the other, because we're going on 50 years that Israel is moving in its own domestic politics further and further right. And where liberals, including Jewish liberals, had seen Israel as an outpost of liberalism, it became increasingly difficult to do that. And then young people, I think, are looking out and saying, like, well, what are the rights and wrongs of this? I agree with you that they have not want to stare in the face of like what Hamas is and what its like founding charter says, although it was revised and so forth. But I also think that so quickly after that initial moment in which there was very little empathy with Jewish victims of October 7th, these young people kind of their suspicions that Israel would strike back hard and ruthlessly with many, many, many more civilians on the Palestinian side dying than on the Israeli, those suspicions were proved right. So I guess I was surprised, but then I also think, youth is in a very different place than most kind of middle-aged or older Democrats have been. But mainly because middle-aged or older Democrats have not like updated their views given what's happened to the ruling coalitions in Israel over the past 5 decades. So I don't think we should be surprised, and it could get worse, obviously.
I often think that there's a cognitive dissonance to what we see out there in the world. Now, I wonder whether the cognitive dissonance is with me or it's with others out in the society. I don't know who's actually, sometimes reality has so many heads. It's hard to make an observation,
Yeah. I guess I'm just making the point that our views were set in an era in which Israel could be credibly or more credibly seen as liberal like us and beset by terrorists. And then the young people today sort of think, well, Israel's not liberal.
Right.
And these terrorists, so-called, sure, they've done dreadful things, but they're also the representatives of this oppressed population that's dying in the tens of thousands. And yeah, I think it's going to have a big effect.
There are conflicts all over the world, Pakistan, Syria, they're everywhere. They contribute to these, immigration around the world. It contributes to a lot of the unease. America can be at the center of some of those. It cannot. Where do you see the fate of the world going? Where do you see it all heading? If human rights are a ribbon blowing around the world in some sense, each country practices slightly differently. Each country has to I always thought that we were at a phase where we would be deciding how to live with different rights and how they bump up against one another. But now it seems like maybe there's a whole new understanding that, where do you see it going?
I mean, I guess at this point, we've had to discard some illusions. I think you and I probably had the similar experience that after 1989 through 91, it looked like human rights were the morality of what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history. And it was sort of, we would do our work as Americans, the American state, non-governmental organizations to spread this final gospel where it hadn't reached. And then disaster struck because there were big gains, notably in Eastern Europe, with the rise of lots of liberal democracy on the ruins of communism. But at this point, a lot of those states, certainly Russia, have reverted back to authoritarianism or conservative democracy like Viktor Orban's Hungary. So it's like, the arc of the moral universe isn't bending in the direction we believed it would. And so I think we revisit and say, look, human rights are what they were for Americans for all of those decades and centuries. Like, we have to establish them on our own through setting up a persuasive form of citizenship that's liberal, that our citizens vote for. Not only did we fail to spread human rights everywhere, we're on the verge of losing them in our own country because our own fellow citizens are throwing liberalism overboard. And so what were our mistakes that led us to not understand that this could happen to begin with? And then what were the mistakes that led all of our fellow citizens to end up voting for a charlatan not once, but twice?
So why? Can we stay there for a minute? Because why are so many, half the country maybe, arguably, throwing this out the window? What are they going to get? What do they want? What are we not giving? What are they not getting? And why would they go that direction?
Against some, a lot of critics, honestly, I've kind of said since 2016 that these are protest voters, and they know in advance that Trump isn't going to give them better lives, but they're furious at the elites who promised them better lives and actually failed to deliver in, I think, two big respects. The wars that were fought in our names, and especially by veterans who almost all go for Trump, weren't like World War II, where you come home triumphant and you feel like you did something not just for your own country, but for humanity. You not only suffered, but set the world back. And then there's the economics. And I just think, we're dealing with the first generation of voters that fears that their children will not have better lives than they did. And that, that was an American privilege for all those decades. And it's not like they think Donald Trump will get them back to the 1950s, but he understands what he called American carnage. And it's also, opioids and all the rest. So I think that after 1989, Americans squandered the requirement of spreading freedom and equality in their own country. Now, very difficult to do with slow growth after the 1970s, but certainly a lot of rich people made out pretty well in this same period. Poor people did too. And so the Democratic Party became a kind of new coalition. It wasn't a working class party like in Franklin Roosevelt's days. It was an urban party uniting the rich and poor. But then there's everyone else who are more numerous, and they got a raw deal, or they perceive themselves to get a raw deal.
If we go and we poll people and we say, well, do you believe in human rights? They say, well, no, I don't. But if you say to them, well, your brother was falsely imprisoned, would you want him out of jail? They would say, well, hey, yeah, of course I support that. So is one of our problems creating an understanding of what this is? We need to lose the nomenclature and just talk about it in different terms.
I think there's an American peculiarity, which is that a lot of Americans think the Constitution was good enough. And so they love the Constitution and they love the Bill of Rights if they get judges to interpret it their way, of course. But they've never seen the need to have human rights too. Now, you could tell them, well, look, where did the Bill of Rights come from? And Jimmy Carter, that president who really did make human rights a big deal, not just in this country, but internationally. He said in his farewell address, America didn't invent human rights. It's the other way around. Human rights invented America. So maybe we could argue with Americans that they're not these foreign ideas, but as of now, they are, or they're for export. They're for everyone else, and we don't need them because of the Constitution. I think everywhere else, human rights are more popular. And there's just a debate about what they mean one by one and as a project.
Fundamentally, there are belief systems around the world. Christianity is a belief system. Is human rights a different form of religion and destined to be on the heap of history?
I hope not, because I believe in them, but I don't think they rule out the need for other faiths, if you will. I do think there is a lot of faith in human rights. In their origins, there are all kinds of rituals like Amnesty International lighting candles, and a lot of those organizations were Christian, and it was one way for Christians to kind of substitute ethics for Christianity that they were abandoning. But I think in the end, we would want to say, whatever you believe, human rights tells you how to believe it. You can't pick up Deuteronomy and live it out, because a lot of the stuff that the Israelites are told to do in there is outrageous. And that doesn't mean you can't be a Jew today, but it does mean that there are constraints on how you interpret your tradition and live it out. And that's true of all the other faiths. But I also think that the age of human rights tells us we might need some other faiths too. Since the 70s, maybe human rights have added some new things to believe in that condition how you believe in everything else you believe in. But then we might need some other ideas, like what happened to international peace? What happened to peace movements? What happened to labor and socialist movements? which kind of died in the age of human rights, FDR's old Democratic Party. And maybe we need like a working class party in the United States because Donald Trump is kind of getting all the votes that that party would otherwise get. And that doesn't mean the working class party can ignore human rights, but it's got a different job than human rights movements.
Can I ask a question about woke culture?
Sure.
Do you think that that was an outgrowth of interpretation of what human rights, that every single individual, every single identification has the right to express itself? And, you just struck me so deeply in these other kind of eras, there'd be, let's all unite around peace, or let's all unite around labor, and now let's all unite around individualism, but how do you do that and still move a society forward? It just seems like a contradiction there.
I think it's a great question. I mean, I guess I would say human rights strike me in this respect as more like peace movements and socialist movements, where the idea was it matters less what particular group you're in than your common humanity and what it requires. And the Universal Declaration starts out by saying everyone's in the human family beyond these lines of gender, race, religion. I think what changed is that in the era of identity politics, so-called, a lot of groups said, well, wait a second, the legacies of how our group is treated lead us, even in this era of the human family, to suffer implicit discrimination. So, the legacy of racism is obvious in America, and the legacy of patriarchy. And so I think they said, well, look, we need to focus on the plight of those groups very specifically. And then, there were a lot of other inferences on top of that claim, like you can only pursue the interests of those groups if you're in the group. At best, you can be an ally. Or there were ideas like we can't know the world the same way if we're in an oppressor group as opposed to an oppressed group. And then how can we be in the human family at all? It's actually like oppressors and oppressed. So maybe we need to, partly because it's just so unpopular and giving Trump a huge boost, maybe we need to control all that last stuff while also finding a way of saying, the liberal civil rights era and the liberal human rights era, it did leave a lot of oppression left to deal with. And it did, disproportionately affect these groups like Blacks and women and so forth, that we need to figure out how to treat equally for real now.
Where does this idea of humanity come from? That there's a shared understanding of what being human means?
A lot of people talk about this big transition that occurred as if morality was originally, familial or tribal or national. And then somebody had a bright idea that the only real group or the important group is all of humanity. I don't think that's false, because clearly those ideas continue to play a big role, tribal mentality or nationalism, especially ethno-nationalism. But on the other hand, you look out at the annals and you see a lot of universalists. Isn't Christianity universalist? Isn't Islam? They all, in theory, are addressed to everyone, everywhere, always. Confucianism, Buddhism. So it seems like human rights aren't the only game in town when it comes to understanding that we're all humans. And then the interesting thing is that all these different universalist outlooks disagree with one another about what it means to be human. And actually, they agree mostly. Christianity and Islam are pretty close, but then the little differences are a sticking point and lead even to war. So it turns out that realizing that we're all human, while potentially a big deal, especially in the face of like exterminatory racists who say the Jews are vermin or whatever, at the same time, it solves fewer issues than we would like, because it turns out that when you say we're all human, you still have to decide what that means and what you do if others disagree.
It does seem incredibly limiting in a way, only because genetically, if we look at, there's so little difference between any of us, between Palestinians and Jews living in Israel, there's no difference,
Sure.
But yet we're killing each other. All babies are innocent, so it's definitely a complicated situation. Well, are you optimistic for the future?
Sort of. I mean, probably relative to most people in my place and time, because I think we've had, especially in the face of this populist wave or, Brexit and Trump in 2016, a kind of apocalyptic mentality set in. And we've been told endlessly that we're on the brink of the end of democracy. Didn't really happen the first Trump admin, even if you want to talk about the last 6 months when he tried a self-coup or January 6th or whatever. I mean, it's not like, the big thing is that the coup was rejected by his own people and party, and then January 6th fizzled. And so maybe there's still a chance to figure out how to beat Trump.
How, just from your, kind of expertise in the law, for example, another 4 years with Trump, what happens to our court? What happens to our legal system? And does the erosion continue? And does it become irrevocable? I guess that's the fear.
That is the fear, and it's well-founded. But on the other hand, I guess I would say tyranny takes a long time, and it can't just be up to one old man that it gets imposed, especially when he, from the beginning, struck me as more incompetent than evil and more of a charlatan than a tyrant. It's not like he's not like Adolf Hitler, who had ideas. Trump's idea is self-promotion and protection. And that doesn't mean that a lot of people who would work for him don't have ideas. And there's this Project 2025 and so forth. But I guess I would say it is likely to be more of the same, a little worse. But if you looked at 2016 and said democracy is going to fail now, people wrote that this was 1933. They were wrong. Now, maybe they aren't wrong now, but I think they're wrong again. So the question is, how do we solve the deeper problem and figure out how to convert enough of our fellow citizens away from these, protest votes towards a more optimistic, uplifting program? But, that could be a mistake. And I guess I think that the world's been trending right in our country for so many decades, and the liberal sorts haven't found a way of appealing to enough voters. And so that could mean that their movement's terminal. It could mean that they could exploit the danger to find something more appealing and popular than they have so far.
Well, Samuel, thank you for your words. Really appreciate you coming on and talking about this stuff.
Oh, thanks for inviting me and having me. I'm grateful.
Yeah, thank you. I'll hold on to your little optimism there.
Yeah.
Sounds good.